Prime Minister Justin Trudeau earned blowback online after he claimed during a recent interview that he didn't force anyone to get vaccinated. Let's watch.
Since the Spanish flu, my responsibility was to keep as many Canadians alive as possible. And all of the scientists and the medical experts and the researchers, not just in Canada, but around the world, understood that vaccination was going to be the way through this. And therefore, while not forcing anyone to get vaccinated, I chose to make sure that all the incentives and all the protections were there to encourage Canadians to get vaccinated. And that's exactly what they did. We got vaccinated to a higher level than just about any other of our peer countries. And that's why we had a less deadly pandemic.
So I think he's being rightly blasted because he did say something there that is not true. He said, while not forcing anyone to get vaccinated, that is simply not true. The truckers were forced to be vaccinated. They later reversed that policy. But you were going to be required, if you're going to be a truck driver coming into Canada, you're going to have to be vaccinated. So that's like that claim is false, which gets so frustrating about people like in Trudeau's position who are railing. And earlier in that clip, he's railing against misinformation and disinformation and how harmful it is and how dangerous speech is because people are just saying things that are wildly untrue. Wouldn't it be better if you had czars of truth to guard against anybody saying anything that was wrong? But the people that would appoint themselves to be the czars ritualistically say things that are not true about the pandemic and every other subject because we are fallible and we are all prone to error, and that's why you're supposed to generally support a climate of free speech and letting people speak because there's no way to just put the person who's right about everything in charge of deciding what you're allowed to say. So it's shameful that he would say that.
So I think that his argument would be, and you heard him make it a little bit there, that he was creating incentives. The carrots rather than sticks to encourage people to get vaccinated. And that technically, I think there was a mandate for public sector employees. There was obviously the whole mishigas with the truckers boycott. That technically, if you were willing to not do that job, to quit a job, right, to not enter a certain kind of public space.
No employment if you wanted to be, sure. If he means it was voluntary because he was not sending jackbooted thugs to lock up people for refusing to be vaccinated, sure.
Yes.
But he was not giving you the freedom to be employed in several professions.
And I think that and other kinds of mandates were promulgated by the territories, but not by the federal government. Yes. So you can read that as kind of judging the truth, which I think is completely fair. But I do think that opens up a broader conversation about what the civil liberties line should actually be. I really do wish that earlier in COVID and now there had been a conversation about what it means when there is a public health interest in a certain kind of compliance and how far, due to that interest, states are ethically able to go to encourage a certain kind of behavior. I've been very consistent throughout saying I wish the government had offered a lot more in the way of carrots rather than sticks. In other countries, people were sent food to their homes to encourage them to be able to stay home. You're given a social safety net and support that allow you to not be at your job. And there was obviously some of that during COVID. But to say, you're not going to risk eviction and be homeless or unemployed or not be able to pay your bills because you're staying home. The government acknowledges that you're taking this hit for a public good, and therefore we're going to compensate you and make sure that you're made whole. I think that kind of a posture is very different from one where you're suddenly asking people to internalize all of these downsides of restricting their behavior. So who knows what would have happened in that instance? Who would have known if there had been more free sending out of tests and high quality masks and food and other kinds of provisions? But, are we also in agreement that there perhaps are instances where the public threat is so significant that something akin to a mandate does need to happen? For example, the way that we mandate various vaccines be taken for children who enter public schools.
Well, right. That has an actual, and there are some people who think those are not proper anyway. In fact, some Republican state legislators are, I think, seeking to undo them. So I'm not going to pretend there wasn't a debate about that prior. There was. But at least the argument is for a public health benefit. That's the argument they tried to deploy for the COVID vaccine, but it just turned out it did not at all meet that standard of significantly protecting a third party if you're vaccinated. And of course, there was always good reason to suspect whether people like truckers who are, driving, who are in trucks by themselves, were at risk of exposing tons of people to COVID if they were vaccinated, if they weren't vaccinated.
I largely agree with that, but I don't want us to memory hole the extent to which one of the arguments was that the hospitals, our public health infrastructure, were being overwhelmed because so many people were being hospitalized with COVID. So some of the third-party risk isn't that you're going to transmit the disease, which the vaccine never really significantly prevented, but that even if it's not just a you issue, it's not just a personal issue, if my choice not to take the vaccine causes there to be such an overflow at the hospital that people who need a liver transplant or cancer treatment or whatever can't access that because the public health infrastructure is overburdened.
Sure. And look, and vaccinating at-risk people, older people, significantly reduced the risk of hospital overcrowding because those are the people that were wildly disproportionately likely. There was David Wallace Wells, who interviewed Fauci yesterday, put it in his article. He's written about this previously. It is difficult to convey with words just how egregious the age skew of severe COVID is. So, and because of the increased risk, many elderly people in this country did get vaccinated. In fact, the overwhelming majority of them. And that was good. And couldn't the vaccine pitch be a little bit more individually tailored? But what they went with at the time was so you got to get this so that the risk of anyone else catching it goes down. Do that to protect the people around you.
Yeah, to protect your grandmother.
And that just wasn't.
Yeah, if it comes out that they knew that the vaccines weren't effective in limiting transmission and they still push that narrative, I would be very upset about it. If they hoped it would have that effect and they push that narrative kind of optimistically, I will still be upset about it, but it doesn't seem quite as nefarious. And I do think there's some extent to which they were waiting and seeing it and rolling out vaccines very quickly and didn't entirely know the effects. Given that ambiguity, I would have liked to have thought that they wouldn't go so hard on the public shaming narrative that said, if you don't get the vaccine, it's because you're selfish, it's because you don't care about your neighbor, you don't care about your family, et cetera. That seems to me to be a real messaging.
I mean, there were a lot of people who were skeptical that it was going to stop cases at the time, which was contrary to what the health officials were saying. So the fact that were those people just accidentally right, or was there a good basis based on the fact that the flu vaccine actually doesn't even stop you?
Well,
maybe it lowers your
the efficacy of the first strain and the first vaccine dose did seem to play out a little bit differently and a little bit more in favor of what was predicted than the later strains.
I mean, it held up for a while, but and as Fauci conceded in that article yesterday, he said he expected the protection to be essentially decades of protection rather than, as it turned out, probably months of. I got my breakthrough case 4-ish months after my original shot. So
yeah.
Yeah,
well, he's getting a lot of heat for this, and I hope there's some reflection on the words that we use and whether or not making these kind of broad claims is going to be perceived as any kind of accurate versus disinformation of its own. We're rising after this.